Okay, I'm having a hard time doing this. This is about the third time I tried this. Okay, let's talk about pest control methods. As long as people have been growing farms, which is, 10,000 years, we've been battling the things that want to share the food or share the land. So the insects that try to eat the crop, the rodents, the other plants that try to grow there, these have all been things that farmers have had to struggle against. And the common term for that is called pest control methods. Now, remember, the Green Revolution changed everything, starting in the 1960s. And basically, at that time, these cultivars that could produce a lot of food in a small amount of space became became widely available. And so people planted lots of them. So you have these huge fields planted with a monoculture with very low biodiversity, and that made it very susceptible to insect infestation or any other kind of infestation, worm infestation. So what happens is with all this food available, if you get a species that likes to eat it, it is able to reproduce at its biotic potential. There's nothing slowing it down. There's so much availability of food that it will just double and double and double. And in a very short period of time, a matter of a week or two, suddenly you have so many of those organisms growing there that you lose your whole crop for the year. So in order to prevent that, it was necessary to find adequate pest control methods. And the pest control methods that were developed during the Green Revolution are chemical pesticides. Now, these are chemicals that are generally complex organic compounds that don't occur in nature, that are designed by humans, that have the ability to disrupt the neurology or the endocrine system of organisms. And these organisms, they're not just insects. It could also be things like worms or rodents or other plants. But collectively, these compounds are called pesticides, and they definitely have some negative consequences on the environment. But at the same time, I want to make an argument they also have some positive consequences as well. Now, in recent years, say like last couple of decades, we're starting into what we call the second green revolution. This one is about genetic engineering. So we're fighting now that biological engineers are able to design plants that have genes in them that are spliced in that make them resistant to certain pests, or able to taste bad to an insect, or make them so they're resistant to certain herbicides so that you can spray them directly on. So it's just worth noting that this new technology is ramping up quite rapidly now, and we call them GMOs, but it is a form of pest management for the most part. Now, listen. When you say pesticide, most people don't light up and go, "Oh, I love pesticides. They're wonderful things." Okay, well, all of us think of them negatively, right? We think in terms of the health consequences to us, right? I don't want to get cancer. I don't want to have this problem or that problem. So I think of pesticides as being bad. And I don't mean to diminish the fact that there are environmental consequences of pesticide use. However, let's consider this. This line here represents how much land is made available for farming. And if you'll notice, from 1961 to, in this case, 2014, when this graph was made, there really wasn't any noticeable increase in the amount of land area available on our planet for farming. But there was definitely an increase in the human population. And if we're going to feed these people, we need to take the same amount of land and get more food out of it, which we have done thanks to the Green Revolution. And so this would not have been possible without, in part, the use of pesticides. So yes, they have some environmental consequences, but at the same time, they have made more food available, so more people get to eat, and food costs less, so people don't have to spend as much of their monthly budget on food. And so those are two good things, but there's also the other unintended consequences, which is really what environmental science seems to always come down to. Now, it's worth noting that when we talk about the use of pesticides, it's not just farmers who use them. I know here in Korea, it is mostly farmers, because there's not a lot of people who have single family homes with yards. But in the United States, and keep in mind this is an Americentric test, in the United States, the majority of people have their own plot of land that they live on, and they do try to cultivate certain things. I don't know if I call it a crop, but they want to have grass, they want to have a yard, they want to have flower gardens, they want to have fruit trees, maybe they want to grow some vegetables, and so they end up having to use pesticides in order to maintain those cultivated plants. So it turns out in America that a significant amount of the pesticides that are in the environment are actually coming from urban users, not so much from agriculture users. And a lot of that's just because there's more rules that the farmers have to follow, and people in their home use tend to be a little bit uh, they don't have the oversight, so they tend to misuse them. Also, it's worth noting that it's not just about pesticides are not just about harvesting plants, right, and growing and harvesting plants. It's also about limiting disease vectors. So, for instance, one of the most famous pesticides of all is DDT. It's the one that Rachel Carson brought to people's attention when she wrote the book about Silent Spring, which let people know about biomagnification and the effect of these persistent organic pollutants and their effects on the environment. That's so catastrophic. But the role of DDT was not in crop production. It was in reducing the incidence of malaria primarily because it was good at killing mosquitoes. So killing disease vectors is something pesticides also use. Here in Korea, it happens all the time. You know, in certain times, in the summertime, you hear this truck coming down the street, and there's all this stuff coming out of it. Well, that's malathion. It's a pesticide, and it's good at killing mosquitoes. And there's spraying doses that aren't going to harm you, as far as we know. But that is definitely one way of using pesticides. Now, agriculturally, though, there are certain culprits that are known ones that we should think about. So, grasshoppers or locusts, they tend to be able to eat crops, and they tend to occur in large numbers. Also, many insect larvae, like moth larvae, often are quite voracious eaters. Fungi are also a problem. So there's certain like the potato blight that happened in Ireland was attributable to fungi. So I know my friends live in South Carolina, they're unable to grow tomatoes. They haven't been onto it for a long time because they have a fungus that lives on their land now, and they haven't been able to get rid of it. Then there's also things called nematodes, or little roundworms. And they can be, they live in the soil, and they can be quite devastating to certain crops. Like this is the root nodules that are associated with, I believe, would be a legume of some sort, like maybe like a soybean, and the nematodes get in there and they destroy it, so the plant just can't live. So there's also worms that live in the soil that are a problem, and there's just other weeds. There's like, you're trying to grow corn, but there's other things that want to share that light and space and water and nutrients, and that becomes a problem. So farmers definitely have to try to contend with those as well. So those are considered pests. So the term pesticide doesn't just mean we're trying to fight insects. It could be anything, including rodents. Look at that little rodent. Actually, I hate all rodents. They're just awful creatures. But that's another thing that people have to fight. So how do you fight them? Well, basically, we either spray little droplets of liquid pesticide into the fields, or we scatter little kernels, little nuggets, little granules of it that either slowly dissolve, or in the case of rodents and some other insects, get eaten directly by them. Now, how exactly do these things kill? Okay, like as I said earlier, a lot of them are either disrupt nerve transmission or mess up the endocrine system of an insect. But how do they actually get ingested? So basically, what you have is the pest can either eat them. Well, let's just look at it. You can basically get sprayed directly on, all right, and so it just goes to their skin and kills them. Or it could be sprayed on the plant, and then when the bug walks across it, it absorbs through their skin that way. So we call it secondary contact. Maybe they eat the plant, so they're ingesting the poison that way. It could just be that it's something that smells bad to them, and the insect avoids it, just moves away from it. Chrysanthemums are good for doing that. It could be something that becomes a vapor, and the insect breathes it in, and that's what kills the insect. Or you could use pheromones. So a sex attractant chemical, and so that the organism is attracted to it and then killed. Now that's not usually used with insect larvae like this, but often it's used with wasps and other flying, stinging insects. Okay, so the early pesticides that we used were things like DDT and PCB and chloridane. And all of these, the problem they had was very, very, very long half-lives. So once they were made, they didn't break down. And as a result of that, they could bioaccumulate. We talked about that earlier in the year. Since we call these persistent organic pollutants, since they don't break down and they're fat soluble, they tend to build up. You have small concentrations low in the trophic level, but as you go up in the trophic level, you get higher and higher concentrations until the higher members of the food web tend to become very ill and die. Now, these POPs have been banned by almost all countries in the world. There's still a few developing countries that use them, but very few. I don't know if they're even manufactured anymore. But the thing is, they're still killing organisms all over the world because they're that persistent. The chemicals that are killing orca whales in Puget Sound today were introduced into the environment in the 1960s and 70s. And they're still out there killing because they're that persistent. They just don't break down. Now, one of the things you should know about is one of the biggest problems with pesticides. And I tried to do a good job in my art, but I should have done my math a little bit better. I thought about it again yesterday when I was hiking. I could have done better. But the idea is called resistance. Okay, so resistance essentially is artificial selection. So it's like natural selection, but it's an artificial selective pressure. All right. So here's the idea. There's genetic variation in all organisms, whether it be bacterial or insect, rodent, whatever. Okay. So here's our initial population. Okay. Now what I've got is the red ones happen to be a small member of the population that have an allele that it's a minor one. It's not a very important one, but it makes them slightly resistant to this particular pesticide. The problem is I made them completely resistant to it. Let's not worry about that. But it makes them resistant to, say, a particular pesticide. So I spray the pesticide on. 2/3 of the ones that are not resistant die off, but the ones that are resistant don't. Now, in reality, some of the ones that are resistant do die. It's just they die at a much lower rate. Let's not worry about that. Now, my population doubles. Well, okay, so look, it doubled, and what I find now is that the resistant ones are a higher percentage of the initial population. Now, I apply the pesticide again, I kill off 2/3 of these, but I don't kill off the resistant ones, and it doubles again. So you see, over time, what happens is the population becomes very, very heavily favored in the direction of the ones that are resistant to the pesticide. And so what happens is, unfortunately, is that over time, farmers just end up using more and more and more pesticide because the things they're trying to get rid of are becoming more and more genetically resistant to it through this process of artificial selection or development of resistance. So what I have here is, unfortunately, you can't see what the axis is here, but it's just time. Okay, so here they are growing at their biotic potential, and the farmer sprays them. Almost all of them die, but not quite. Well, the ones that are least likely to die are the ones that have that resistant gene, which is initially a very small part of the population. Then they grow at their biotic potential. The farmer sprays again. Well, this time a fewer number of them die because more of them are resistant. And this happens again and again with each application. Even though the farmer might be using more and more and more, there's still fewer and fewer of them die. And ultimately, the population went from here to here, except when we get to here, this population is almost entirely resistant to that particular pesticide. And so we find that this happens with antibiotics, with humans too. This resistance is a real problem that happens with farmers using their pesticides. Another problem with pesticides is that they don't always kill the target. They don't only kill the target species. Sometimes they kill non-target species. So I wanted to kill, let's say, grasshoppers. So I sprayed my fields. But you know what? That spray also kills butterflies. And those butterflies are beneficial and they're an important part of the ecosystem. But I accidentally killed them because they're susceptible to the same chemical. So that's a non-target species. Well, some of these non-target species might, say, be like a wasp. Or and they basically are predators of this very species I'm trying to get rid of. So there is this moth larva, caterpillar in my fields eating all my crops. So I spray. Well, I killed a lot of the caterpillars, but a lot of them are resistant. They're coming back. But unfortunately, I also killed a lot of wasps. And these wasps, as they often do, lay their eggs in these caterpillars. Well, without the wasp to do that, now I have even fewer of my caterpillars dying. So what we find is by accidentally killing non-target species, it often exacerbates the problem. It's not just a problem in its own right that I'm killing something I didn't mean to kill, but it's also making my pest problem worse. The other thing is that, plants don't just need to be protected from pests, they also need water. And so we tend to irrigate our fields. And when we irrigate our fields, many of these pesticides are water soluble. And so they'll get carried by that water, whether it's natural rainwater or irrigation water. And what will happen is they can be carried away as runoff, and they can get into streams and rivers and lakes. And two things can happen. In some cases, especially with insecticides, they can kill things like amphibians and fish directly. Like they're toxic to these organisms just as they were to the insects. And so when they get into the rivers, those chemicals will get ingested by, say, the amphibians and kill the amphibians. But what also happens is herbicides can get into, these things that kill plants. They get into, say, a lake system, and they kill off a lot of the plants that live in the lake. Well, when these plants die, they get eaten by bacteria, and that causes eutrophication, and the dissolved oxygen level drops as the bacteria use up all the oxygen, and you end up killing fish that way. So letting these pesticides out into streams through runoff is a real problem, and it's definitely something that regulations try to avoid, but it is an inescapable consequence of the use of pesticides on crops. Now, you know, most places in the world get their drinking water out of rivers. Now, they understand that they need to treat that water, so they have systems in place to try to get rid of sediment and to try to get rid of things that might make you sick, mostly bacteria, but they don't try to get rid of everything. One thing that isn't often gotten rid of is pesticides. And so in many places, there are pesticide residues in the water that people drink. Now, one way you can get rid of that is by using a carbon-based filter at your house, like a Brita filter or something like that. But another problem we have is that pesticides end up in the soil, and when they get in the soil, they kill soil microbes, especially if it's a fungicide I'm spraying. And so what happens then is that the bacteria in the soil that are responsible for nitrogen fixation and nitrifying bacteria, they end up getting killed as basically a non-target species. And then the soil becomes low in nutrients. And as a consequence, the farmer realizes that they just have to put more fertilizer on the land, which leads to other problems that we'll talk about in a different one. So definitely killing these soil organisms is a problem that happens for the use of pesticides or the overuse of pesticides. Now, what do these do to people? All right. So if you do ingest them, okay, if they get into, say, the groundwater, if they get into your drinking water, what happens? Okay, so for the most part, the effects are very, very limited. They're not nearly as big of a health threat as you might think, but basically what they can cause, they've been shown to cause, are birth defects, increased risk of cancer, infertility, immune system problems, like for instance, allergies, and neurologic problems. The problem with our ability to move our bodies, and muscle spasms, or development of brains. Now, so these problems are not, they're obviously not insignificant. As again, it's like you'd have to be exposed to quite a bit of it. In most cases, you won't be, but they can be accumulative, and we have to consider that. Now, if we use pesticides and too much, and they get a lot of irrigation water, can carry them down into the groundwater. Once they're in the groundwater, they will tend to stay there. So then people who drink from wells tend to get pesticides that way. Now, the main threat to people from pesticides is the workers who are actually applying them. So people like this who are applying the pesticides, they're far more likely to have that, that list of problems we just talked about. They're the ones who are mostly going to have this because they have significantly higher exposures. And remember, in the world today, we tend to use less persistent pesticides. So the amounts that you're going to be encountering in your drinking water or left over as residuals on your vegetables and fruits, it's pretty minimal. I mean, I understand your concerns, but it's really people like this that are most at risk from it. So again, let's talk about this. Yes, there is pesticide residue on your foods, okay? And I understand that might be something that makes you worry, but people have run the numbers and they say, well, okay, look, if we look at the risk to you from ingesting these pesticides versus the benefit to you from eating more fruits and vegetables, it's significant. And so it turns out that the health benefit of having more vegetables in your diet, more fruits and vegetables in your diet, far outweighs the negative aspects of ingesting these pesticides. So please do not avoid eating fresh fruits and vegetables because you're afraid of the pesticides on them. Go ahead and wash them, okay? But keep in mind, the amount of pesticides you're going to encounter very small, but the benefit, the health benefit of eating a healthy diet is tremendous. You can also argue that that pesticides are good because without them, there'd be a lot fewer people surviving in the world today. So basically, if we just look at what's happened is over the course of ever since the Green Revolution, look, the food production in country after country after country has gone up, and in no small part because of pesticides. So they have some negative aspects, but they definitely have a lot of positive ones. Now, another thing is that we can reduce the need for pesticides, as we said earlier, by genetically engineering plants to be resistant to certain organisms. Maybe you can put in a gene that makes them smell bad to the insect larva that would eat it, and so it stays away. Okay, uh, but the problem you have there is when you start going to genetically modified crops, the real problem is that you're really tremendously limiting biodiversity, and that always leads to problems. We can't think what the problem is going to be, but we know if you have very limited biodiversity, you are going to encounter problems eventually. Okay, sorry to go on so long, but that was pest management.